It was a quiet morning in the small town of Brookville, a place where nothing much ever happened. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow over the sleepy streets. Most people were still inside, sipping coffee or getting ready for work. But on the corner of Main and Fifth, something unusual was about to unfold, one that would shock the entire country. FBI Captain Marcus Ellison had been driving through town when he noticed two local officers pulling over a man on the side of the road. Something about the way they handled the situation caught his attention. The man looked nervous, hands raised, while the officers stood close, one of them gripping his gun like he might use it. Marcus knew from experience that things could go wrong fast. He parked his car a short distance away and stepped out, making sure to show his badge clearly as he approached. He had no intention of interfering. He just wanted to observe, maybe offer help if needed. But the moment the officers saw him, their body language changed. One of them, a tall man with a thick mustache named Officer Daniels, turned sharply toward him. The other, Officer Reed, narrowed his eyes and took a step forward. Marcus raised both hands slowly, showing his badge again. "I'm FBI," he said calmly. "Just checking on things." But instead of relaxing, the officers tensed up even more. Daniels let out a short laugh. "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England," he muttered. Before Marcus could respond, Reed grabbed him by the collar and shoved him hard against the hood of his own car. Pain shot through his ribs as his badge clattered to the ground. "Hands behind your back," Reed barked. Marcus tried to speak, to explain again who he was, but the officer wasn't listening. "Wait," Marcus started, but a cold metal barrel pressed hard against the side of his head. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't procedure. This wasn't right. "Don't move," Daniels growled, voice low and full of hate. Marcus stayed frozen. Around them, a few people had come outside, watching from doorways and windows. Some held phones, recording everything. But no one dared to step in. No one spoke up. Marcus felt the cuffs snap around his wrists, tight enough to hurt. He tried to stay calm, to think clearly. He knew panic wouldn't help, but deep down, a fear settled in his stomach. He was being targeted, not because he had done anything wrong, but because of the color of his skin. These officers weren't seeing a federal agent. They were seeing a black man, and in their minds, that meant he was a threat. They dragged him roughly toward their patrol car, shoving him into the back seat without care. As the door slammed shut, Marcus looked out the window at the growing crowd. A few faces showed anger, others confusion. One older woman shook her head and walked back inside. A teenager kept filming, hands trembling slightly. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind only silence and questions. Inside the station, things didn't improve. The booking officer barely glanced at him before typing something into the computer. "Name?" he asked, voice flat. Marcus gave it, along with his badge number. "I'm an FBI captain," he added. The officer didn't react. "Sure you are," he muttered, handing him a plastic bag for his belongings. Marcus handed over his watch, wallet, and phone. There was no call made for him, no attempt to verify who he was. Hours passed. No one came to see him. No one offered food or water. He sat alone in a cold cell, the walls bare and the floor damp. Outside, life went on normally. Officers laughed and talked in the hallway, unaware or unwilling to question why a man claiming to be FBI was locked up. Somewhere in the building, the two officers who had arrested him were probably drinking coffee, thinking they had done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, Marcus's mind raced. Where was his team? Why hadn't someone figured out what was happening? He knew the system well enough to understand how slow things could be. But this was different. This was personal. He wasn't just dealing with bureaucracy. He was facing real racism dressed up as authority. Back outside, the video taken by the teenager had already started spreading online. Within minutes, it reached hundreds of thousands of people. Social media exploded. People watched in horror as a decorated law enforcement officer was treated like a criminal. Hashtags formed. Free Agent Ellison. Justice for Marcus. Stop Racist Cops. News outlets picked it up, replaying the footage over and over. Commentators debated what had happened, some calling it a misunderstanding, others calling it a clear case of racial profiling. By evening, the story had gone national. Calls flooded into the police department demanding answers. Activists organized protests outside the jail. Reporters gathered in front of the station, microphones in hand, waiting for any official statement. Inside, Marcus remained silent. He knew speaking without a lawyer present could do more harm than good. He also knew that the truth was already out there, in the video, in the eyes of those who had seen it all happen. Then finally, after nearly 20 hours in custody, a familiar face appeared at the cell door. It was Special Agent Karen Moore, one of Marcus's closest colleagues. Relief washed over him. She looked furious. Without a word, she signaled to the guard, who reluctantly unlocked the door. Moments later, Marcus stepped free, blinking in the bright light of the hallway. Outside, the world had changed. His name was now known across the country. Some called him brave, others called him lucky. But Marcus didn't feel either. He felt angry, tired, and deeply aware of how fragile justice really was. He had spent his life fighting crime, protecting people, serving his country. Yet today, he had been treated like an enemy by the very system he believed in. As he climbed into the black SUV waiting for him, he looked back at the jail one last time. The building seemed smaller than before, less intimidating. Maybe because he now knew the truth, it wasn't the building that held power. It was the people inside it. And sometimes, those people abused that power in ways that could destroy lives. The ride back to headquarters was quiet. Karen sat beside him, offering only brief updates. "Everyone knows now," she said softly. "They can't ignore this." Marcus nodded, staring out the window. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't interested in headlines. What he wanted was change. Real change. And for that, the fight had only just begun. The moment Marcus stepped into FBI headquarters, the mood shifted. People who had worked alongside him for years stopped what they were doing to look. Some rushed over with questions, others just stared in silence, unsure of what to say. He was used to being respected here, treated like a leader, but now he felt like a symbol of injustice, of resilience, of something bigger than himself. Karen walked beside him, keeping a quiet but firm presence, making sure no one pushed too hard or asked the wrong question. Inside the director's office, the atmosphere was tense. The room was filled with senior agents, legal advisors, and media liaison. They all turned when Marcus entered. The director, a tall man with silver hair and tired eyes, stood up and shook Marcus's hand firmly. "We're glad you're okay," he said, voice low but sincere. Marcus nodded, but didn't respond right away. He wasn't here to talk about how he felt. He was here to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. They spent the next few hours going through everything. Marcus described the moment he approached the officers, how they reacted, the way they ignored his badge, his words, and even his identity. He told them about the gun at his head, the rough cuffs, the long hours in the jail with no food, no call, no explanation. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes showed the pain. The legal team took notes, recording every detail. The media team discussed how to handle the public response without making things worse. Outside, the story continued to grow. Protesters gathered near the White House demanding justice. News anchors debated the meaning of the incident on live television. Social media was flooded with videos, comments, and calls for reform. For many, Marcus's experience was proof that racism still ran deep in law enforcement. For others, it was another example of why trust in police was breaking down. Either way, the country was watching. Back in Brookville, the two officers responsible remained on duty, shielded by their union and the local sheriff's department. When reporters tried to reach them, they refused to comment. Their lawyers released short statements saying they had acted out of fear, claiming Marcus had not properly identified himself. But the video told a different story, one that millions had already seen. By the end of the day, the FBI issued an official statement. It confirmed Marcus's identity, condemned the actions of the officers involved, and announced a full federal investigation into the Brookville Police Department. That night, the news played the statement on loop. Politicians weighed in, some calling for immediate arrests, others urging patience. Marcus watched from his apartment, feeling both empowered and exhausted. He had spent his life fighting for justice. Now, justice had to fight for him. The following morning, Marcus met with his team behind closed doors. They went over the footage frame by frame, analyzing every second of the encounter. The video was clear. Marcus had shown his badge, stated his name, and followed protocol. The officers had not only ignored him, they had mocked him. One moment, in particular, stood out. After cuffing him, Officer Reed had leaned close and whispered something in his ear. The camera couldn't pick up the words, but Marcus remembered them clearly. "You think your badge matters out here? Not today." That line haunted him. It revealed more than just racism. It exposed a mindset that saw power as something to be abused, not protected. And that scared him more than the handcuffs or the jail cell ever could. As the week passed, pressure mounted on local authorities. Federal officials demanded answers. Civil rights groups filed lawsuits. The mayor of Brookville called for a press conference trying to control the damage. But nothing could undo what had been done. The town was now known not for its quiet streets, but for the moment a decorated FBI agent was treated like a criminal simply because he was black. Inside the FBI, Marcus became a reluctant figurehead. Agents who barely knew him came up to shake his hand. Younger recruits looked at him with new respect. Some asked if he planned to speak publicly, to share his story. He hadn't decided yet. He knew silence wouldn't help, but he also knew speaking out would bring more attention than he wanted. Still, he understood the weight of what had happened. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been mistreated by someone in uniform. Karen sat with him one evening in the office, sipping coffee as they reviewed the latest updates. "You know," she said quietly, "this is bigger than Brookville." Marcus nodded. "It always was," he replied. She looked at him carefully. "Then what do you want to do?" He thought for a moment before answering. "I want the truth to come out. I want those officers held accountable, and I want people to understand that this isn't just a few bad apples thing. Something's broken, and we need to fix it." She didn't argue. She just handed him a folder. Inside were reports from past incidents involving the same officers, complaints that had gone unanswered, internal investigations that had gone nowhere. It was all there. Proof that this wasn't the first time these men had abused their power. Proof that the system had failed long before Marcus ever set foot in Brookville. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in his mind. He thought about the people who had watched it happen and done nothing. He thought about the ones who had recorded it, hoping someone would believe them. He thought about his parents who had raised him to believe in fairness and justice, in the idea that if you worked hard and did the right thing, you'd be treated right in return. He wondered if they would be proud of him now, or heartbroken. By the time morning came, the wheels were already turning. Federal investigators arrived in Brookville armed with subpoenas and warrants. Interviews were conducted, records pulled, and slowly, the full picture began to emerge. Officers who once claimed ignorance started talking, afraid of what might happen if they stayed silent. The sheriff, under increasing scrutiny, gave a brief interview denying any wrongdoing but refusing to answer specific questions. Marcus stayed out of the spotlight for a few days, letting the process unfold. He focused on recovering, spending time with family, reconnecting with friends who had sent messages of support. But he knew the worst was still ahead. The trial would come soon enough. The courtroom would be packed. The nation would watch. And he would have to relive every painful second all over again. Still, he was ready. Because this wasn't just about proving what had happened to him. It was about proving that the system could be held accountable. That truth could win. That Justice, even when delayed, could still be served, and as he stood outside FBI headquarters one morning, watching the sun rise over the city skyline, he felt something he hadn't felt in days: hope. Not because the battle was over, but because he knew now that he wasn't fighting it alone. The days leading up to the trial were filled with tension. Reporters camped outside the courthouse waiting for any update. Activists gathered in protest, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus," and "End Racist Policing." Inside the courtroom, preparations were underway. Lawyers reviewed their notes, witnesses were called in for questioning, and the jury was selected under intense scrutiny. Everyone knew this wasn't just another case. It was a moment that could change how people saw law enforcement forever. Marcus spent most of his time preparing with his legal team. They went over every detail of what had happened that morning in Brookville. He practiced answering questions calmly, clearly, without letting anger cloud his words. He knew how important it was to stay focused. If he lost control, even for a second, the defense would try to twist his words. They had already started painting him as someone who provoked the officers, someone who didn't follow procedure. But Marcus knew the truth, and so did millions of people who had seen the video. Karen stayed by his side through it all. She had become more than just a colleague. She was his strongest supporter, his voice when he needed to stay silent. "You're not just fighting for yourself," she reminded him one night as they walked home from the office. "You're fighting for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color." Marcus nodded but didn't respond right away. He had always known racism existed, but now he was living proof of it. And the world was watching. Inside the courtroom on the first day of the trial, the air felt heavy. Families of victims of police brutality sat in the back rows, hoping this case would bring some form of justice. The two officers, Daniels and Reed, sat stiffly beside their lawyers, avoiding eye contact with Marcus. The judge entered, silence fell, and the proceedings began. The prosecution opened with the video footage, showing the exact moment Marcus was shoved against the car, the gun pressed to his head, the way he tried to explain who he was. Gasps echoed through the room as people watched it again, even though many had already seen it online. The defense tried to argue that the officers had acted out of fear. They claimed Marcus hadn't clearly identified himself, that he approached too closely, that he might have been hiding something. But the prosecution shot down each point quickly. They showed the badge he had held up, the calm tone of his voice, the fact that he was alone and unarmed. They brought in experts who explained proper police procedures and how the officers had violated nearly every rule of engagement. One by one, witnesses took the stand. The teenager who had recorded the video described what he saw, how he had frozen at first, unsure whether to keep filming or intervene. An older woman who lived nearby told the court she had called 911 after seeing the arrest, only to be told there was nothing they could do. Even a former officer from Brookville testified, admitting that complaints against Daniels and Reed had been ignored for years. Then came the internal reports Karen had given Marcus weeks earlier. These documents showed that both officers had been accused of racial profiling before. They had been investigated multiple times, yet faced no real consequences. When these papers were presented, a murmur spread through the courtroom. People had suspected corruption, but now they had proof. The system had failed long before Marcus ever stepped foot in Brookville. Marcus finally took the stand on the 5th day. He wore a simple suit, his posture straight, his voice steady. He answered every question honestly, never raising his voice, never breaking composure. He talked about his career, his dedication to justice, and how painful it was to be mistreated by fellow officers. When asked how he felt during the arrest, he paused for a moment before speaking. "I felt like my life didn't matter," he said quietly. "Like I was just another black man they assumed was guilty." His words hung in the air. Some in the courtroom wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply stared, absorbing everything. The defense tried to challenge him, asking if he had done anything to provoke the officers, if he had followed protocol exactly. But Marcus answered every question with confidence. He had nothing to hide. Outside the courthouse, protests continued. People from across the country traveled to show support. Civil rights leaders gave speeches, calling for reform in police departments nationwide. News stations broadcast live updates, replaying key moments from the trial. The story was no longer just about Marcus, it was about systemic injustice, about the need for real change. By the end of the trial, the evidence was overwhelming. The officers had no defense strong enough to counter the facts. After hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict, guilty on all charges. Daniels and Reed were sentenced to prison for abuse of power, unlawful arrest, and violating Marcus's civil rights. The sheriff, who had refused to act, resigned shortly after. Federal oversight was placed on the Brookville Police Department, forcing them to undergo major reforms. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus stood silently, absorbing what had just happened. He had fought for justice, and justice had won, at least this time. Karen placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's over," she said softly. Marcus looked around at the people still lingering, the reporters rushing to file stories, the activists celebrating a small victory. "No," he replied. "It's just the beginning." That night, the news played clips from the trial on loop. Commentators debated what it meant for the future of policing. Social media exploded with messages of support for Marcus. Some called him a hero, others thanked him for standing up for what was right. But Marcus didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who had been wronged and who had fought back. Back at his apartment, he sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about the road ahead. This case had exposed deep flaws in the system, but fixing those flaws would take more than one trial. It would take years of work, of pushing for accountability, of making sure people in power couldn't abuse it again. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages waiting for him. One from his mother read, "We are proud of you." Another from a young boy in Chicago said, "You made me believe I can be whoever I want to be." He smiled slightly, touched by the impact his story had made. The next morning he met with FBI leadership again. They praised his courage, acknowledged the importance of the case, and promised to use it as a lesson moving forward. But Marcus wanted action, not just words. He pushed for new training programs, better oversight, and stronger protections for agents working in the field. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he had a platform now, one he intended to use wisely. As he walked out of headquarters that afternoon, the sun was shining brightly. The city bustled with life, unaware of the battles being fought behind closed doors. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He had faced something terrible and come out stronger. He had proven that truth could win. And, even though the road ahead was long, he was ready to walk it. The weeks after the trial were filled with noise. News stations replayed clips of the courtroom showing Marcus's calm testimony, the video footage that changed everything, and the moment the guilty verdict was read. His face appeared on magazine covers, talk shows, and even billboards in major cities. People who had never heard his name before now knew his story. Some called him brave, others said he was lucky to have survived. But Marcus didn't feel like a hero or a symbol. He felt tired, worn down by the weight of what had happened. Back at FBI headquarters, things seemed normal on the surface, but beneath it all, something had shifted. Colleagues who once treated him like just another agent now looked at him differently, some with pride, others with caution. The case had shaken the agency, forcing leaders to confront issues they had long ignored. Internal meetings were held behind closed doors, policies were reviewed, training sessions were scheduled. Marcus was asked to speak at one of them, sharing his experience not as a victim but as a warning, proof that even within law enforcement, racism could wear a badge and carry a gun. Karen stayed close, watching how the attention affected him. "You don't have to do this," she told him one evening as they walked out of a long debriefing session. "You've already done enough." Marcus shook his head. "No," he said. "This is exactly why I'm doing it, so nobody else has to go through what I did." Outside the FBI, the ripple effects of the case continued to grow. In Brookville, the police department was under federal supervision, its officers forced to undergo new training. Protesters had turned the town into a symbol of injustice, holding rallies and demanding change. A few officers resigned, unwilling to face the scrutiny. Others remained, claiming they were being punished for the actions of two bad cops. But Marcus knew better. He had seen the reports. He had read the complaints. He knew this wasn't about punishing good people. It was about fixing a broken system. In Washington, lawmakers used his case to push for new laws aimed at increasing police accountability. One senator introduced a bill requiring body cameras for all officers during routine stops. Another proposed stricter consequences for those found guilty of racial profiling. Debates filled the airwaves, some arguing that the changes went too far, others saying they didn't go far enough. But Marcus didn't care about politics. He cared about real change, about making sure no one else would be shoved against a car simply because of the color of their skin. Still, not everyone saw him as a force for good. Online, there were those who criticized him, calling him an agitator, accusing him of exaggerating what had happened. Some claimed the officers had been unfairly targeted, that Marcus had played the race card to gain sympathy. Comments flooded social media, both supportive and hateful. Karen warned him not to read them, but he couldn't help it. He wanted to understand who still stood against him, what kind of mindset allowed people to defend what had clearly been wrong. One night, after a particularly harsh interview where a news host questioned whether his case was truly about racism, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years fighting crime, protecting people, serving his country. And yet here he was being attacked for speaking the truth. He thought back to that morning in Brookville, the cold steel of the gun against his temple, the way the officers had laughed as they cuffed him. He had survived that. He could survive this too. The following months brought more speaking engagements. Universities invited him to talk about justice and reform. Civil rights groups honored him with awards. He met survivors of police brutality, listened to their stories, and shared his own. Each time he spoke, he made sure to remind people that his case was not unique. It was just one of many, only different because of the camera that had captured it. "I was lucky," he told a crowd at a conference in Chicago. "Not because it didn't happen to me, but because the world got to see it." But despite the support, the pressure never let up. The FBI began receiving threats against him, some from extremists who believed he had betrayed the badge, others from conspiracy theorists who claimed the whole thing was staged. Security was increased around his home. Agents watched his movements more closely. At first, it felt excessive. Then, when a man tried to break into his building late one night, he realized it wasn't. Karen confronted him about it over coffee. "You're not safe anymore," she said. "Not just because of your job, but because of what you stand for." Marcus nodded. He had always known the risks of speaking out. He just hadn't expected them to come so soon. "I can't stop," he told her. "If I do, then what was the point?" As the year came to a close, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had lost sleep, faced public scrutiny, and dealt with threats he never imagined. But he had also gained something, proof that truth mattered, that standing up for what was right could make a difference. He had friends who supported him, colleagues who respected him, and strangers who wrote to thank him for giving them hope. On New Year's Eve, he stood on his balcony, looking out at the city skyline. Fireworks lit up the sky in bursts of red, blue, and gold. Around him, people cheered, celebrating the start of something new. He thought about the past year, the pain, the fight, the moments when he had almost given up. And he thought about the future, uncertain, but full of possibility. Karen joined him outside, handing him a glass of wine. "You okay?" she asked. He smiled slightly, nodding. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking." She leaned against the railing beside him. "About what?" He looked at her for a moment before answering. "About how much has changed, and how much still needs to change." She raised her glass. "Then we'll keep fighting." He clinked his glass against hers. "We will." As the final countdown began, the city roared with excitement. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the cold night air fill his lungs. He didn't know what the next year would bring. He didn't know if the reforms would last, if the attention would fade, or if the fight would get harder. But he did know one thing: he wouldn't stop. Not now, not ever. Because justice wasn't just a word, it was a battle, and he was ready to keep fighting. The months after the trial blurred together for Marcus. He kept working, kept speaking, kept pushing for change, but something inside him had shifted. The weight of what had happened in Brookville never fully lifted. It lingered like a shadow, always there, even on the brightest days. People saw him as strong, as fearless, but he knew better. He was human, and humans broke, even if they didn't show it. Karen noticed it first. She had worked beside him long enough to know when he was holding something back. He still smiled, still gave powerful speeches, still met with lawmakers and activists, but his eyes told a different story. They were tired, guarded. Sometimes, during meetings, he would drift off for a second, lost in thoughts she couldn't reach. When she asked if he was okay, he always said yes. But Karen knew better. One night after a long day of media interviews, she found him sitting alone on the rooftop of FBI headquarters. The city stretched out around them, lights blinking like stars fallen to earth. She sat down beside him without a word, waiting. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I keep thinking about that moment," he said quietly. "The gun against my head. I can still feel it." Karen didn't say anything at first. She just listened. That's what he needed. Most, someone who understood that words weren't always the answer. He continued, voice low. "People think this is over. They see the verdict, the reforms, the headlines, and they think justice has been served. But it's not that simple." He looked at her then, eyes searching. "It changed me, Karen, not just professionally, personally. I used to believe in the system. Now, I don't know if I ever will again." She nodded slowly. "You don't have to believe in it blindly," she said. "You just have to keep fighting to make it better." He gave a small, tired smile. "That's the problem," he admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." The confession hung between them, heavy and raw. But Marcus didn't stop. Even when doubt crept in, even when the pain flared up unexpectedly, he kept going. He knew others were watching. Young agents, students, people who had faced similar injustice. They looked to him for hope. He couldn't let them down. Back in Brookville, the town remained under federal oversight. Reforms were slow, resistance high. Some officers embraced the changes, understanding that policing had to evolve. Others resisted, claiming the rules were too strict, that they were being unfairly judged. But Marcus knew the truth. Real reform was uncomfortable before it became normal. It had to be. One afternoon, he received a letter from a teenager in Chicago. The boy had watched the trial, followed the news, read every article he could find. In the letter, he wrote, "You made me believe I can be whoever I want to be, even if people try to stop me." Marcus read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He carried that message with him, letting it remind him why he kept going. Still, the emotional toll was real. Sleep came harder than before. Dreams of that morning in Brookville haunted him. Officers laughing, guns pressed to his skull, the cold metal of the cuffs digging into his wrists. Some nights he woke up gasping, heart pounding. Other nights he simply stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment, wondering how things might have gone differently. Therapy helped, though he hadn't wanted to admit it at first. Karen had pushed him to go, saying he deserved healing as much as anyone else. At first he resisted. Talking about it felt like weakness, but eventually he gave in. Sitting across from a counselor who didn't judge, who simply listened, gave him space to breathe. He learned to separate the trauma from his identity. He wasn't broken. He was bruised. And bruises heal. As time passed, he started to rebuild trust. Not in the system, maybe not completely, but in people. In those who stood beside him, who fought alongside him, who believed in justice as fiercely as he did. He formed stronger bonds with fellow agents, especially those who had once stayed silent but now spoke up. He mentored younger officers, teaching them what it meant to serve with integrity, to protect without fear or prejudice. Karen remained his closest ally. Their friendship deepened, built on shared struggle and unspoken understanding. They didn't need grand gestures to know they had each other's backs. A look, a nod, a quiet presence was often enough. Outside the FBI, the movement grew. More cases surfaced, more stories of injustice, more videos capturing moments that should never happen. Marcus spoke at rallies, not just about his own experience, but about others who hadn't had the same chance to be heard. He used his platform to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. At one event, a mother approached him, tears in her eyes. Her son had been killed by police years ago. No video existed. No justice had come. "You're giving him a voice," she whispered before walking away. Marcus stood there, heart heavy, knowing no amount of speaking could bring her son back. But maybe, just maybe, it could prevent another family from suffering the same loss. Despite the progress, the fight was far from over. Laws were passed, policies updated, but real change took time. Marcus knew that one case, no matter how powerful, wouldn't fix everything overnight. There would be setbacks. There would be resistance. There would be moments where it felt like nothing was changing at all. But he also knew that courage wasn't about feeling strong all the time. It was about standing up, even when you were afraid. It was about continuing forward, even when the road ahead was unclear. It was about believing in something greater than yourself, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise. One evening, as he walked home through the city streets, he passed a group of young boys playing basketball outside a community center. They laughed, shouted, moved with the kind of energy only youth could carry. One of them spotted him, nudged his friend, and called out, "Hey, you're that FBI guy." Marcus smiled slightly and nodded. The boys gathered around, curious. One of them asked, "What's it like being a real agent?" He crouched down, meeting their eyes. "It's hard work," he said, "but it's worth it. You get to help people. You get to do something that matters." The kids exchanged looks, absorbing his words. After a few more questions, he stood and patted one of them on the shoulder. "Keep working hard," he said. "You can be whatever you want to be." As he walked away, he heard them whispering excitedly behind him. Maybe they'd forget his name tomorrow. Maybe they'd grow up and choose different paths. But maybe, just maybe, one of them would remember this moment and decide to fight for justice in their own way. And that, Marcus thought, was enough. Years passed, but the story of FBI Captain Marcus Ellison never faded. It became a case studied in law enforcement academies, a moment dissected by scholars and activists alike. The video that had once shocked the world was now shown in classrooms as a warning, proof of what could happen when power was unchecked, when fear overpowered reason, and when racism wore a badge. Marcus continued his work with the FBI, though he no longer carried the same blind faith in the system he once had. He had seen its flaws up close, felt them press against his skin like cold steel, but instead of walking away, he chose to stay and fight from within. He pushed for reforms, trained new agents, and made sure that every officer who came through the academy understood the difference between authority and abuse. Karen remained at his side, not just as a colleague, but as a trusted friend. She had seen him at his lowest, watched him rebuild himself piece by piece, and stood beside him as he turned pain into purpose. Together, they worked to ensure that what happened to Marcus would never be ignored again. They fought for policies that protected officers and civilians alike, for oversight that held people accountable, and for training that taught respect over control. Back in Brookville, the town slowly changed. Federal oversight forced the police department to restructure, to hire more diverse officers, and to implement stricter guidelines on how stops and arrests were conducted. Some resisted the changes, clinging to old ways, but others embraced them. Over time, Trust between the community and the police began to rebuild. Not overnight, not perfectly, but steadily. One day, years after the trial, Marcus returned to Brookville. He didn't come as an agent on assignment, nor as a speaker at a rally. He came simply to walk the streets where everything had changed. He visited the corner where he had been arrested, the jail where he had spent the night, the courthouse where justice had finally been served. He stood quietly, letting memories settle around him like dust. A group of teenagers passed by, one of them recognizing him instantly. "Wait, is that you?" the boy asked, eyes wide. Marcus smiled slightly and nodded. The kids gathered around, asking questions, wanting to know what it was like to stand up to something so big. He answered them honestly, telling them about the fear, the struggle, and the long road to change. He reminded them that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing what was right even when you were afraid. As he walked away, he heard one of the boys say, "Man, I want to be like him." That's when he realized something. He hadn't just survived that moment in Brookville. He had become something bigger than himself. His story wasn't just about injustice anymore. It was about hope. Across the country, more cases surfaced, some similar to his, some worse. Each time Marcus spoke out, not to relive his own pain, but to remind people that silence was not the answer. He met victims' families, listened to their grief, and promised them that their voices mattered. He worked with lawmakers to push for stronger protections, for better accountability, for a future where no one would be treated differently because of the color of their skin. Still, there were those who opposed him. Talk show hosts called him divisive. Online trolls sent threats. Some former officers whispered that he had betrayed the badge. But Marcus didn't stop. He knew that real change never came from staying quiet. It came from standing firm, from speaking truth even when it was uncomfortable, from refusing to let history repeat itself. He wrote a book, not to seek fame, but to tell his story in his own words. It became a bestseller, read by students, officers, and citizens from all walks of life. In it, he detailed not just what happened to him, but how it affected him, how he rebuilt himself, and why he kept fighting. He included letters from people who had written to him over the years, from young men who looked up to him, from mothers who feared for their sons, from officers who admitted they had once been wrong but now wanted to do better. The book reached places protests couldn't. It opened minds that had once been closed. It gave people a chance to understand, not just react. Eventually, Marcus stepped back from the spotlight. Not completely, but enough to reclaim parts of his life. He took fewer interviews, avoided political debates, and focused more on mentoring the next generation of leaders. He traveled less, spent more time with family, and found peace in small moments: a morning run, a quiet dinner, a late-night conversation with Karen about the world they hoped to leave behind. But even as he stepped back, the impact of what he had done remained. The laws he helped shape stayed in place. The training programs he supported continued to grow. The message he carried, that justice must be earned, not assumed, echoed through every reform, every protest, every voice that rose in defiance of injustice. One evening, as he sat on the rooftop of FBI headquarters, watching the city lights flicker below, Karen joined him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word, then sat beside him. For a while, they just watched the skyline, letting the silence speak for itself. "You ever think about retiring?" she asked after a while. Marcus chuckled softly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't think I'll ever stop fighting." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They sat there for hours, talking about the past, the present, and the uncertain future ahead. They spoke of the battles still left to win, the lives that still needed protection, the systems that still needed fixing. And through it all, one thing remained clear. They had started this journey together, and they would finish it the same way. Because justice wasn't a destination. It was a path, one that had to be walked every single day, and Marcus Ellison was ready to keep walking.